Okay, we are live, and thank you, everyone. Hello, and thanks for joining us here on YouTube tonight. Welcome to the Columbia College Chicago Design Lecture Series. My name is Ivan Bernetti, and I teach in the Design Department's illustration program. I wanted to say thank you to our chair, Duncan McKenzie, for facilitating and making this lecture series happen. So thank you for that. And tonight, we would like to present Andrea Bell, who this fall has become our newest adjunct faculty member in the illustration program here at Columbia. Andrea Bell is an illustrator and comic artist that lives in Chicago. In 2013, she earned her BFA in illustration from Columbia College in the illustration program and began self-publishing titles such as Fair Voyage and Still Waiting. Andrea has since gone on to illustrate the Diary of a Fifth Grade Outlaw series with Epic Creations and The Leak with First Second Publishing, as well as the anticipated 2021 title, Maker Comics, Conduct a Science Experiment. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Andrea's work is currently featured in the exhibit Illustration New Faculty Showcase. So I wanted to let everyone know that showcase includes 4 of our newest hires in illustration, Jackie Alcantara, Sherry Lee Charlton, and Denise Holmes. And that is in the currently through the fall semester available for people to see in the Gallery 700 space, which is located on the 7th floor of the 623 South Wabash building. And the gallery is open during business hours, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. We will have time for a Q&A session at the end of Andrea's talk, so feel free to type your questions in the chat. And that's pretty much all I have to say. I always hate a long introduction, so I just want to say thank you to Andrea for coming here tonight and doing this talk. And everyone, please give a warm welcome to our guest, Andrea Bell.
Okay, I think I'm on the screen now. Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you to the design department for having me as a part of this lecture series. As Ivan said, I am also a graduate of Columbia, so this feels like a nice welcome home. And tonight I wanted to just do a deeper dive into my journey of making comics from when I was a kid making some into The Leak with First Second, covering a broad of topics from self-publishing to working with a major publisher. So I will dive right into it and share my screen with you all. Let's see here. Great. Okay, so yes, my name is Andrea Bell, and I consider myself an illustrator, comic artist, and now an educator at Columbia in Chicago. And I earned my BFA in illustration in 2013. And hey, look, you can find me on Instagram as well at Andy Harvest, all my work there. So I mostly work in a early middle grade sphere of publishing, and a few of the comics and books that I've illustrated on from self-publishing on, as Ivan mentioned, I've self-published Fair Voyage, Still Waiting, and I've worked with e-publishers like Madeline Editions on titles like Vampire Pool Party, Diary of a Fifth Grade Outlaw is an ebook, but also in traditional publishing with Andrew McNeil. The Leak, which is my newest book that came out earlier this year with First Second, and Maker Comics, Conduct a Science Experiment, coming out with through First Second this December. And along with illustrating, I'm also a colorist on comics. So a few titles that I've have credited as a colorist on are the Wrapped Up series, volumes 2, a few issues there. And that was published with Linework, The Isle of the Lost, which is a Disney title, and the most recent being Twins, which is through Scholastic. So that was primarily just color work, but another facet of what I do as a comic artist. And so, yeah, as we begin this comics journey of myself, I thought it'd be fun to show off one of my first little comics that I made, I think around age 11 or 10. And I'd say like I had a pretty rudimentary introduction into comics as far as like Sunday funny newspaper, Garfield's and Peanuts. But I think there was something that struck a chord when I was introduced into manga as a kid, because that sort of felt like it opened the door as like, oh, comics can be more of this like epic adventure, not just for boys. It could be more than superheroes and focus around young girls and adventure and magic girls and that kind of realm. So a few of my favorites in that were Fulikuli, Ranma 1/2, Inuyasha, Naruto, Cardcaptor Sakura, and literally anything I could sneak in the house because these things were not allowed at home. But that is what that's where I found my first love for comics, was through manga. And you can even see with this little Hoshi, which I believe the title of this one was, I was even setting it up like a manga where it would read right to left, which I still think kind of impacts how I compose my covers, a little backwards, but yeah. And then moving a bit forward to Columbia, which I feel like is the next time that I actually considered making comics again. When I was at Columbia, I really thought that my career path was going to take me more into the animation side of things, maybe storyboarding, maybe character design. But it wasn't really until I had my core comics classes of like cartooning and making the graphic novel that I kind of fell in love with this love I had for comics. And not only that, but I was quickly being introduced to how deep comics it runs through Chicago and all the great artists that live and make work in our city. And places like Quimby's bookstore in Wicker Park that has live comics readings, and just really like getting introduced like, oh, Chicago can really be this place where I can set up some comic roots. So I kind of last minute switched gears from building a portfolio that was mainly character design and storyboarding and focused more on self-publishing comics. So this one here, The Solid Citizens, was a final project that I made in my graphic novel class, just about a compilation of really smart decisions, which essentially is really dumb things that my friends did and that I have forever made into comics. And this Let's Play, which was kind of the introduction into my later story, Fair Voyage, this idea of like a more tomboy girl character who can like hold her own in a fight. So these are really some sort of like the beginnings of some of my other stories that I ended up using those ideas later. Then we have Big Answers from Little Dog, which was the comic strip that I created for the Columbia Chronicle, the newspaper. The comic section was called Free Ice Cream. So weekly I would submit these 4-panel comics that more or less were conversations I was having with myself. I am very so clearly this main protagonist here, and although I do not have a little dog, if I did, these were the conversations I would be having with them about, sometimes I feel like I don't have a best friend. somebody I can always have a good time with. Do you have a best friend, little dog? I'll be your BFF. So very, very sentimental feeling type of work. And here we can see some of the relics of my, I guess, college process, more traditional sketching, and then using blue pencil and inking over. I still kind of miss making work this way. So it was fun to dig up some of these for this presentation. So then after I graduated and I was kind of building up this repertoire of mini comics, I had heard of a smaller press in Chicago called Yeti Press, which held one half Eric Rosner, another Columbia grad, and one half a person named RJ Casey, and had published a lot of people from Columbia that I admired deeply their work, like Kat Lay, David Alvarado, Kevin Budnick, and I heard they were seeking comic pitches. So I had a couple ideas and met up with RJ at a pizza parlor, I believe, and I don't think either of us ordered any food, so I felt very anxious the entire time. Also trying to tell this person like, hey, can you publish this story of mine? But they liked the idea, and it was for this cute horror comic, but also had a lot of heart coming of age story called Rose from the Dead, and they accepted it. And it was going to be a part of their kind of bundle Kickstarter. They were going to do 2 batches of that. I believe it was a winter and a spring collection of books, and mine was a part of the spring collection, I believe, of 2014. So graduated in 2013, met up with Yeti Press right after, and then started working on this graphic novel for somebody else, which was kind of my first entryway into making, besides a teacher, I suppose, but like making something for someone else that would then be kind of advertised and pitched to like the Kickstarter audience and their built-in fan base. So that was intimidating, but I learned a lot making this book. I guess like technically, I learned more about printing. I'd only been making kind of those mini comics myself in school, Xeroxing things together. So this was also my first deeper dive into like making sure my files were print ready. And I remember making a few mistakes, but I also remember that I knew people I could ask for help. So that creative posse from school really came in handy. Yeah, so a lot of technical things, but also the more you draw, and like you see this in a graphic novel too, that are longer page amounts, like the more you kind of fit into your own style and like figure things out as you go. So I'm very grateful to Yeti Press and Rose from the Dead for letting me work on myself through this book. You can see this is still, these are the original pages too from Rose from the Dead, where you can still see the artifacts of that older process with the blue lines here. That would be the sketch layer, this like photo blue pencil. And then I believe I was using probably a combination of whatever pen had ink, but most likely a Micron, to fill in lines. And then I believe these little X's here were for adding that digitally. I realized that I just sometimes don't want to do all the black fills traditionally. So I was doing a weird combination of that, of sketching, inking traditionally, scanning in, editing, adding fills, adding adjustments, and then coloring digitally. And then this one is the image to the right is the cover image that we had here. So you can kind of see the process from those two. Right. Yeah, so then as Rose from the Dead became a tangible book, and I was invited along with Yeti Press to do like I guess time at the shows at their table. So I believe it was Cake, so Chicago Alternatives Expo, and then we also went to Toronto Comic and Arts Festival, TCAP. That I went to those shows alongside Yeti Press, and it was such a great experience just being behind a table and being able to show like this is the book I made and talk to other artists about it. And yeah, I kind of just fell in love with the comics community as a whole, not just the Chicago one, but like we exist everywhere, and it's so exciting meeting everyone and just like hearing what their projects are that they're working on, and like, you know, getting into shop talk. And I don't know, there's a lot of really fun's not the exact right, but there's a lot of really creative and interesting works that come out of these shows that like I just really wanted to be a part of that group, and like keep making work to like keep up with the caliber of these really great artists at these shows. So I decided that I wanted to self-publish my next project. I had, you know, teamed up with Yeti Press for Rose, so I wanted to become a little bit more independent on that front. And then also part of it was so I could get into shows just on my merit. So I decided to dig into another story idea I had, which was kind of based off of one of the stories I did at school. And this one was called Fair Voyage, which I lovingly call an adventure girl comic. It's about this last elf who uses these two opals for power and defense, and she teams up with another girl named Des to save the world. Kind of an all ages fantasy adventure girl story. And this was good because I wanted to work on something new and keep working on comics and get better, because that's the only way that I've realized that how I get better is if I have a comic that I'm constantly working on. And I would start applying to more comic shows, and when these shows are juried, they really they really want to see if your book exists in a tangible form. So that was some pressure put on me of like finishing this work, printing it, getting it done. I was self-imposing deadlines, but also I gave myself the deadline of these shows I got accepted to create the next installment of Fair Voyage. And I won't, I believe Chris Elio is in the audience, but he gave me the best advice when I was telling him about Fair Voyage. And he asked how long it was going to be. And I was like, I don't know, I'm not really sure like how long the story is yet. And he's like, 100 pages. Make it 100 pages, print it, call it a day. And I think that was the best advice for me, because that gave me the clear reason to like end it at a certain point and to make it its own book. And here we have some more original pages. Same, I mean, my style has been evolving a little bit from, you know, Big Answers from a Little Dog to Rose from the Dead, now to Fair Voyage. It's evolving. The techniques are about the same. I'm still blue pencil, sketching, inking, scanning in, coloring. But I suppose the difference with Fair Voyage, I wanted to push myself again with the coloring aspect of it. There's always something I wanted to work on since college was color theory and coloring comics. So for Fair Voyage, I decided to kind of mimic. I was really into Piao, RIP Piao, the small indie publishing that was out of Sweden and New York. But they did a lot of risograph work, and it was pretty trendy at the time, but I didn't have access to a risograph printer. So I decided to try to mimic it to the best of my abilities with some textures and added noise and blue tones in Photoshop to my pages. And it took a while, but I believe so. I started Fair Voyage, I believe, in the end of 2014, and then I had this full paperback book of the plus 100 pages that I self-published myself. I think I put that out the beginning of 2017. But all that to say is I was not only working on these comics and working on Fair Voyage and trying to build my illustration career, but I was also working retail jobs and customer service jobs. So any extra time I had, I was trying to apply to shows and make more mini comics and work on Fair Voyage. So the fact that this was a little bit of a slower process, or that it took so many years, I think it's okay. And I know a lot of people kind of struggle with working another job alongside of trying to build an illustration career or some sort of design or art career, but I think it's a very normal part of being an artist at this point. And because one of my dreams was to self-publish some of my own work and have more autonomy over my own output. And so if I had to work to fund these sort of projects, then that's just part of my journey as well, I believe. But yeah, I don't regret it all, because once I had this tangible 100+ page comic, it opened a lot of doors, or should I say eyes, when I was at these comic shows. So I kind of kicked it into high gear with exhibiting at shows. I started solo exhibiting 2014 to, whenever we are able to showcase work again in a safe way. But I started exhibiting at about 10 to 15 shows across US and then in Canada. This particular show was in Vancouver at their comic arts festival, but anything from an indie library show in St. Louis to New York Comic Con, I just wanted to be at all of them. And you start making friends that you always see at these shows. So part of it was work and part of it was experiencing a new city and experiencing the community there, but also was seeing friends and catching up with them in that way. But yeah, now that I had completed books on my table, especially one that was over 100 pages, I could see that it showed a lot of editors that stopped by, editors from different publishing houses or even agents and other people in the industry, other artists, that I was ready to work with a bigger publisher, or people saw that I was dedicated to finishing my own self-imposed project, that they're okay, this person is taking their work seriously. I think, here's my card, kind of, it's almost an unspoken rite of passage, oh, they can make this, then perhaps they can also be dedicated to my work or my project. So that is kind of exactly how the leak came to be. And I like telling this story too, because I think a lot of people don't consider business cards to be that viable, but this is how I got this book deal, or at least how I believe I did. I was contacted by Mark Siegel, who's the editor and creative director at Per Second, and a fantastic creator in his own right. And he wanted to know if I was interested in doing some test art pages for Kate Reid Petty's script called The Leak. And I was so excited because Per Second was top of my list of who I wanted to work with. And I feel like I kind of stumbled into this coincidence, or right right place, right time. But honestly, what happened was Mark picked up my business card in Seattle. The art director for a second picked up my business card in Chicago. And then another editor, I think, grabbed my business card in Toronto, because these shows were maybe 2 weeks apart. And I was just doing a whole big tour in the spring of 2018. So when they were looking for someone to reach out to for Kate's script, they all had my business card and were able to contact me. And I had those books on my table that showed that I could handle a longer form project. So part of me is like right place at right time, but also like I definitely did the work to get to that place at that time, for sure. And then this is, I don't know if I might have shared some of this work publicly, but hello, here it is. So the art pages I had to do, I think they asked me to do 4 test pages. So this is one of them on the left here. And they asked for some character designs, which for pitching comics is pretty standard. I'd say most of the time I'm asked for between 6 to 10-ish sample pages if we're sending in a pitch with a script. And then definitely seeing the character designs in the row like this to see how each one kind of relates to the other, size-wise, proportion-wise. Yeah, and I was, I'm still learning a lot. You'll see in the next slides that this initial page and these character designs looks totally different from how the leak turned out. But with my experience, my books on the table, talking with the editor, they felt that I was ready, and I did too. I really wanted to work on this book, so we were able to land that pitch and sign a contract to work on the leak. And that would have been in the summer of 2018. So after contract was signed, it kind of went back to the writer, Kate's hands, where she finished up the script. Because normally with a pitch like that, you kind of submit the outline and character descriptions, but the writer will usually only submit like the first chapter or first 30 pages. So there was a little bit of a lull time, or at least on my side, where I wanted to start drawing but needed to wait until the script was finished. So in that time, I was working on some background designs, revising character designs, fleshing out some other characters, thinking about color palette. There's a lot of work I could do prior to the thumbnails, which then when I was able to get the thumbnails, I kind of did a combination, or get to the thumbnail stage. I did a combination of thumbnail sketches. I feel like Ivan in here, being my old faculty advisor, might be like, no, but I swear I did thumbnails first and then just kind of layered on top. But these are those initial thumbnail sketches, using some darker lines to get some characters standing out. Still getting comfortable with my word balloons. I got better as the book progressed, but they're looking a little wonky here for sure. Yeah, and then here we go, line art. And so for the leak, I didn't use any black in any of the line art or anything. I was using a bunch of ranged purples and believe some I think this would be like the darkest that it ever went. It's this like very deep purple. And then all the line work was done with this textured kind of crayon-like brush that I have in Photoshop. And I should mention at this point, this is kind of when I was making the switch to becoming a fully digital artist. I stopped, sketching and inking traditionally and scanning in. I had gotten a Cintiq tablet hand-me-down from a friend, so I was also kind of getting used to what my new process felt like on the tablet at this time, and kind of fell in love with this like textured brush. And then from there, we move on to coloring and, you know, filling in the word bubbles, making sure there's enough space for all the text there. I'm very fortunate at First Second, they have a great designer, Sunny, who was the one who actually placed in all the dialogue for these pages. So my focus was just on the artwork for the book. And it's a lighter palette. I was thinking of some like old kind of, I don't think they're scholastic, but kind of these like old textbook, children's book feeling, that I remember having some of these books as a kid, of like old math books that I think my grandma had given me. So trying to play on this like faded ink kind of palette for the whole book. Then about say halfway through the coloring process is when myself and Kate, the author and the art director, started talking about different cover ideas and thumbnails for the week. And I came up with these 3 initial thumbnails for them. This one being a little bit of a play on she has an online newsletter, so a lot of pop-up windows, a little mystery there, silhouette of her. We wanted it, because this is middle grade too, we kind of wanted it to be character centered. The second being Ruth and then her friend Jonathan looking at the water, and then the dirty leak that's in there. And then this one that was my favorite, that lucky enough that's what we went with, was our girl Ruth staring off into the distance, and then the silhouette of Jonathan behind, and this water splash motif on the bottom. And yeah, I'll tell you the story with the cover. Well, one, I flipped it because of that. I feel like this is my manga problem here, where I have Ruth looking in the opposite direction of the reading direction. And I was like, all right, I should flip her. We're opening the book here. But the initial feedback from the art director was to add in some more elements, that Ruth is a journalist, so she uses her phone camera a lot, she uses her notebook. The story takes place in fall, so I wanted to add some of that foliage and this mock-up here. But one of the notes was they wanted it to feel more ominous and more dramatic on the cover. And so this blue sky was just a bit too cheerful. So I tried to somehow skirt the line, be like, oh yeah, you mean like this more ominous, this more dramatic, of having this like dusk sunset in the background. Not exactly. They kept trying to push the like, what about a thunderstorm? What about like a street light? Or like, what about like just making it super gloomy? And I don't know what it was. I just like had something else in my head, and then felt frustrated. And I was like, I'll just redraw the whole cover differently. And so I did this iteration and sent that to my art director. I was like, what do you think? It's like, no, we love the original. So what's going on creative wise, like creative blockage? And Kirk and I had a really nice conversation about what I was feeling with the cover and how I didn't want to draw a thunderstorm. So we kind of combined these 3, I'd say we took some elements from this last iteration I did into the final here, where we definitely darkened and made the background more gloomy, have Jonathan, you know, more in shadow, gloomy, and change the color palette up a bit to give us our final cover. And this was also while still finishing the book. So we had a deadline to get to and needed to condense everything into that timeline. But I did want to go over the full timeline for anyone who is interested in Self-Publishing graphic novels. So I feel like if you were taking notes, you might already catch these dates, but I'll reiterate that I was emailed about test pages June 2018. That's when Mark introduced me to the project, sent a couple bits of the script and the pitch so I could do test pages and the character designs. That went off to an acquisitions meeting. We were successful, and so the initial contract, I believe, was sent sometime in July, of which, when it was all like said and done, we signed in September. So that was like, yay, officially we are doing this book together. Great. And then I believe I mentioned that at that point, then the onus went back onto Kate to finish the entire script for the graphic novel, which is 240 pages. So she took her 30 pages that she had for the pitch and fleshed out to the full amount. So then from getting the finished script, I worked on my thumbnails and my sketches from November of that year till March. And from that, I don't believe there was any, every publisher is different, but I don't believe there's any initial feedback on my thumbnails. Sometimes there is, it depends. I've had publishers that are checking in every step of the way of like minute details, but we kind of did the bulk of that later on. From there, I started on my line work that roughly took about the same amount of time, and then, coloring, which started September 2019 and then went to December. I think I even asked for an extension because this is my first graphic novel of this length, so I definitely anticipated how much time I needed for everything. But you live and you learn, and now I have some sort of record so I can use this when budgeting time for other projects in the future. And I will say that all the editors along the way were like, do you need more time? How are you feeling on this? This good? So there are very kind people in the industry that will also watch your back if you think you can get something done sooner, but they're like, hey, let's give you another month. Take it. they know the struggle. Yes, okay, so finished the coloring and the final artwork December 2019. We started doing copy edits periodically from March 2020 to August 2020. I looked back at my email and I think there were like 3 different versions of the book to copy edit and to do art edits on. And then the publication date was earlier this year, March 16th, 2021. And that is kind of this condensed life cycle of a graphic novel, but really only from my side. Like Kate Reed Petty is still the writer, and I'm sure she has her own life cycle of how long the story took for her to write as well. So yeah, graphic novel is definitely a long-term commitment. Okay, and yeah, as I'm wrapping up, but and I do want to, I hope there's some good questions popping up in the chat, because I'd love to deep dive into more topics. But some of the other stuff that I do as an illustrator and comic artist is, well, one, I am a new faculty at Columbia College teaching an intro to illustration class. So that is part of my time. I do coloring and flattening for other people's comics, as I mentioned earlier tonight. I do private commissions. I do event and gig posters. I run a Patreon page, and I have a newsletter that I send out through there, and like a postcard subscription through that. I do comic cover illustrations. So maybe it's a serialized comic, but then I'll just do the B cover for that story. I have an online shop that I sell wares through that I design and contact manufacturers and do all that customer service. I've done reproduction work for museums, and I'm also constantly working on new comic pitches and new ideas and the pages and the work that goes along with that. So a lot to be busy with, but I feel very fortunate that throughout this entire journey I've outlined that I'm at a place now that I can say that I'm doing illustration full time. And yeah, I mean, what year? Okay, it's 2021. I graduated in 2013. It didn't happen overnight. It was definitely a steady grow, and I was working other jobs almost more than half the time after graduation. So this is definitely like, what do they say? Like not a walk, not a sprint, but a walk. No, something like that. You're not sprinting toward the finish line, but you're getting there. You're just keeping it up, and you'll get there. And that's my presentation. Thank you all for tuning in for that. Definitely get out of this.
If anyone can see me, my Zoom screen has just turned black. But can everyone hear me or give me some thumbs up in the chat or something? I'm going to change my view here in Zoom and see if, here we go. It was just my Zoom screen just turned completely black. So I'm like, oh no, I'm kicked out. But thank you so much, Andrea. That was really, really great, really informative. And at no point, I think you mentioned that I would have disapproved of something. I did not see anything that I wouldn't have done myself or would have advised any differently. And we actually have similar parallel histories and the process that it takes, like the different steps you went through with self-publishing and then getting involved in those projects. So anyway, thank you so much for sharing you just not only the history of what you're doing, but the process of how you've done these projects. So thank you so much. I believe I'm going to get some in my chat window, some questions that are going to be forwarded to me because I couldn't actually see them during the talk. I have one. Would you be open to looking at a student's work who put together a novel? I'm assuming a graphic novel.
Yeah, totally. I before teaching, I was pretty open about mentoring, mostly Columbia students, but I've mentored other creative folks. So yeah, I would say the best way to get that in front of me is to email me, andreabelldraws@gmail.com, and that's on my website and social media. So I'd love to look through.
Yeah, that's it's very generous of you. I saw that you had a few times offered that to our students, that you would just do a portfolio or review just out of the goodness of your heart and your generosity, which a lot of people are not willing to do that. So I thought that was great. Did you get a good response when you've offered that up from students?
Yeah, we were kind of talking about it backstage, but I'm a kind of a firm believer in, like, I would prefer these kind of conversations to be like free and available. And like, if I have time to look over something, that's when I offer it. So yeah, I always like tell people to email me. And if it takes me longer, like I'll let the person know, like, I'll get back to this in a month. But I think these walls should be broken down more, because that's the best way that I started learning from folks too, is like reaching out to people doing the thing that I wanted to do and seeing how they did it.
Yeah, so that's great. Now a lot of questions have just popped up in the chat here, so let me backtrack. This is from Cecilia Jane. How would you travel and prep or pack for conventions in places out of Illinois?
Oh man, that's a really great question, because I'm kind of known as like one bag Andy, I suppose. I say one tip for that is to make small books. Like Fair Voyage is pretty tiny in comparison, and Some of my other mini comics were a bit smaller. So that's one way. But I suppose like getting into the nitty gritty, like, yeah, I have one suitcase that I packed, have a personal backpack, and I normally don't, if I'm flying places, I normally don't check those things because I get a little anxious about things getting lost. But yeah, I'd say maybe smaller books is the way to go.
That sounds good to me. Someone once told me, like, don't spend money at the convention until you've made money at the convention. And I've tried to do that, but it's very hard because it is an investment to
That's
do
true.
it. But
Yeah.
one thing, I'm going to get to the other questions, but one thing that you had mentioned in your talk that was really important too was using these conventions as kind of deadlines, so that like, oh, okay, I'm going to have something at this convention, and being strategic about it. Like, and as you said, like, it's a great way also to just think of it as I mean, I hate to use the word networking because a lot of it is friendships and just being part of a community. But I think that's another really important aspect. And anyway, so that was a really good advice. How would you compare self-publishing to working with a publisher? There's actually several questions on this one. How does the timeline for work differ, and what are the pros and cons of each? So comparing self-publishing work versus working with a publisher.
Yeah, and I will say that, like, I feel you can do both at the same time too. So not like, it doesn't need to be one or the other, it can be both. I'd say, like, at least when I'm self-publishing, that almost feels like an exercise, or I guess an exorcism rather, of like getting out these ideas, these thoughts. And I am in full creative control. So I guess it feels more like an art piece in that sense, where I guess there is some sort of understanding that if you're working with a publisher, there's consumers involved. So there's going to be other people that have some comments on not necessarily the creativity, but they're in the industry and they do have research and experience to back up some of the decisions that they're making. So you don't get full creative control, but you also get the support of a whole team. And in the instance of the leak, they had designers and art directors, and I didn't have to do the lettering for the leak. So there's some labor that gets removed off my plate as well, so I can focus on just the artwork.
Yeah, and part of it was about the timeline of how that differs. But I think you touched on that a little bit, in the sense of you created your own deadlines, and like for things like shows or events that you would go to. So even with self-publishing, I was curious, like, so you're kind of imposing some deadlines on yourself as well, versus the publisher gives you a timeline. But do you feel like that's helpful to give yourself little kind of deadlines along the way, even for a project where you're totally in control and can take 20 years if you want?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think I strive when I feel like someone's expecting something from me, which is why I was using these shows as the deadline. Because if I showed up empty-handed, there could have, I mean, I doubt there would be repercussions, but there could have been, I don't know, somebody walked by like, there's nothing on your table. So for me, like, that's how I motivate myself to finish things. And I think that's why, like, school was fun for me, is like I enjoyed like giving my teacher this thing. But likewise, like, yeah, there's when when you're working for the publisher, like, there are pretty set timelines, but you can also ask for an extension. It doesn't hurt to ask. Yeah, it feels kind of the same, but I guess it all comes down to just how you get motivated to finish work.
Sounds good to me. I have another question here from Reed Davenport. For the leak, how are you paid exactly? Is it like royalty based, like the author? So I guess this is a question about like advances and royalties and how those things work.
Yeah, that's a really good
You don't have to
question.
tell us what you got
Yeah.
paid.
Here's my checkbook. Yeah, no, I think it's a good question because I didn't really know too much until I tilled the leak. That was my first kind of experience with learning how royalties work. And I can say it does differ from contract to contract, from publisher to publisher, what they're able to offer. But most of the time, for an illustrator or author, you're given in advance, which is like a lump sum of money that they more or less expect you to live on as you're creating this work. So that's part of it. But once the book is out and it's making sales, you as an author or artist won't start earning those royalties until your advance is made back. So, let's just say 50K was my advance. That could have been given in installments of like, 25K here, 25K there. But once the book has earned back 50K and maybe even 100K because they had to pay the writer as well, that's when you all will start earning your royalties on each copy sold. And it does differ. Well, I wonder, and then how are you paid exactly? I suppose like installments was, I guess, part of that answer, and then direct deposit. But
All nickels. They give you a big
yeah.
bag of nickels.
Yeah. But I guess part of that too is I wasn't represented by an agent when I signed up to the league. I do have representation now, and so my payments come through them because they are taking a cut because they are helping advocate for me and helping send my work to publishers to get book deals and that. So that's another part of that as well.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. Basically, the part that always is hard for people to get is like it's an advance on royalties. So you're actually getting paid your royalties before the book has sold, but the expectation is that then the author has some money to live on, and then like basically everything you said was a great way of explaining it, that once the book makes that money back, then you get money for any additional copies sold, and that's the royalty part. Mm-hmm. So great explanation for something that I think is really complex until you actually have to do it, right, and deal with it. Yeah. What was the book that made you want to make your own comics?
Oh, what was the book that made me want to make my own comics? I don't know if I have an answer, but I mean, I suppose it. There's like a few titles that are coming to mind, but I suppose like it wasn't just one book. It was like going to Chicago Alternative Comics Convention, like, and seeing people that felt like peers, people I went to school with, or just people, and like all of their books, like they did it. So I was like, I can do this too. So I don't think there was one particular for me.
Yeah, you mentioned some of our former students, like people who graduated from Columbia, like Kat Lay and David Alvarado and Kevin Budnick, and they were getting published. So I think you kind of covered that, like just seeing things that seemed attainable, like, hey, that's somebody that graduated from Columbia just a little bit before me, and they're getting work published. So how do you maintain a steady income was the next question that came in. So you kind of covered that a little bit toward the end. You have different...
So I guess a lot of diversifying the streams of income. Also, I'm a big advocate of bookkeeping and like trying to set goals for myself monthly and recording down like all my rates and everything so I can grow. That's like part of it too, is like I'm setting my own rate. So if I'm not, every year I gain more experience. If I'm not increasing my rate, what am I doing? But I'm a really big advocate of like not not doing taxes, but like keeping all your stuff in order, because who else is going to bookkeep for you besides yourself when you're freelance. Yeah. So,
Yeah, that's a great answer. Just keeping track, right? Like
yeah.
income and expenses.
Yep. Yep.
That's essentially like you've already done most of your taxes if you keep track as you go. So that's
Mhm.
I think that's great advice. Um, what jobs were you working from 2013 through X? I guess let's say
Oh,
whenever you
yeah.
were not
Yeah.
working outside jobs. How did you find time to illustrate?
Yeah. So I worked at DSW, the shoe store, throughout Columbia when I was a student, and then a few years after I graduated, and I befriended my manager. And so when I and I was a really good employee too, I should say that first and foremost. But like when I needed time off to do shows, like we made it work. Like I was trying to be like I tried to level with them, being flexible, which I know is not always the case, but if you're able to find like some sort of side job that allows that flexibility, I think that's key to building your career. And then I also worked at Busy Beaver Button Company. I worked there as customer service and social media for 1 year. And then as comic and illustration work was growing a bit, I pitched them a position that was part-time social media manager. So created that flexibility for myself that I would be in the office 1 day a week, but I'd be, social media was a thing I could do for them remotely. So I was doing that and had flexibility to travel to shows and also work on my own stuff. And then I guess I went full-time freelance, I think like right as I was getting the leak stuff signed away. So I think at the end of 2018 is when I stopped working there and I went full time into illustration.
So 5 years with other jobs, but for the audience members that don't know, Busy Beaver Button is a company that makes buttons, which is a great idea. Like, and they actually, yeah, pin back buttons. Should specify. So
Yeah.
it's also a creative atmosphere
Yep.
in itself, right? So it's maybe it's not illustration, but you're around other creative people.
Yes, and they had a printer there that they let me use.
That's great
So,
too.
so there was other perks as well, for sure.
Yeah. Let's see what else we have here. What is the process you go about for coloring? And you did show some of these questions came probably earlier in the lecture, so you did cover some of that, but I don't know if you want to reiterate any of that.
Yeah, I ought to make like another video on that just itself, but I think my process is similar to like a cell shading animation style, where I start out with usually just flat colors for a lot of the pieces. My work's usually has line art, so I'm more like painting by colors, adding flat colors in there, and then going in, adding shading. I'm like looking off screen at one of my drawings to like be like, what did I do for that? Highlights, effects. I'd say it's pretty straightforward. Like I don't think I'm doing anything particularly fancy, as I see some people on TikTok doing, and I'm like, save that technique. But yeah, I think a lot of it is with changing my line color. Like I rarely use a black line. And usually when I set the line color, it kind of sets the mood for the rest of my palette. And I kind of tweak the shades and tones from there. So a lot of kind of like adding some saturation and being like, oh, how's this feel? And then going back in and adding more layers.
Yeah, so very kind of intuitive process. Like you said, like just making one decision, like the line starts to give the page a feel that then you can kind of expand on. And it's also great you mentioned that doing this, you actually do it for other people as well. And that's actually like an area of income for cartoonists and illustrators. So
Mhm.
how did you manage your time to balance working and creating without burning out?
Who says I didn't burn out? No.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of sadly inherent when you're doing something that you love so much, is that you don't know sometimes when to tell yourself to stop. So I think just like setting up a really good routine, at least, of like waking up at an okay time, making your coffee, maybe going for a walk in the morning, like setting up these rituals that you do, but then you'll work for the 12 hours or whatever it may be, but with breaks in between, so you're not just, burning yourself completely out. I feel like there could be another part of that, manage your time to balance working and creating. I mean, there's like this concept of artist dates, from the
Oh
artist
yeah.
way. That
Yes. Those are great.
yeah.
Julia Cameron. I have it right next to me. I could pull it
Oh
out.
yeah.
It's just coincidence. Uh,
Yeah,
the Artist Way by Julia Cameron has.
yeah.
So do you do the morning pages as well, or you know about that? Or
Yeah, I think I should pick up her book again to redo all the
Mhm.
lessons for the winter, but I got halfway through and was doing morning pages every day, but then, got burnt out. But I really did was drawn to her concept of the artist days, which essentially is just a way to kind of refill your creative cups, like watching a movie that you enjoy that gives you inspiration, going to a museum, I mean, they're like listening to an album, like different ways that, and like the way I interpret it doesn't necessarily have to be me drawing in my sketchbook to kind of re-energize myself, but things that remind me of like ideas, or like get me inspired again. Sometimes for me, that's just like going down a Pinterest rabbit hole for an hour and just like seeing
yeah.
other people's work, which artist dates are a bit more challenging to do during a pandemic, like maybe museums and comic shows and things like that would normally be a go-to. I have to find alternatives for.
Yeah, from what I remember, it could be anything, just as long as you devote that time and it's kind of for yourself. So it's kind of but anyway, it's a book I can recommend as well. That's a great concept in there. It's kind of like respecting your time as that's your time, and you're going to do something that you feel recharges you, whatever that might be.
Yep.
So let's see I think some of these questions probably came in kind of earlier, and then you ended up kind of covering them in the talk, but we can just kind of go over how and when did you first start going to conventions?
Yeah, I might have sped it through it in my talk, but the first convention I went to was with Yeti Press, with Rose from the Dead at the Toronto Comics Arts Festival. I believe that was the first time that I had a place behind a table. And then after that, I went to Cake, Chicago Alternative Comics Expo with Yeti Press. Again, had a place behind a table, had my book I could talk about, but was very eager to do my own solo endeavor. So the first show I applied for was Cala, which was the first year they were doing it, Comic Arts LA. And I got in. I'd never been to LA before, didn't know anybody, but booked an Airbnb, and it lucked out that originally it was going to be a shared room, and then they ended up moving out of that space and kept my booking the same. So I had a downtown LA apartment that I could walk to the convention to. But yeah, LA was my first show. So I kind of went backwards and then applied to, I think like Chicago Zine Fest was one of the next ones. And some other small ones, because there are a lot of like gallery or even like bar shows that happen, or like shows at breweries, like little craft fairs. So I was just kind of seeing posters or hearing murmurs online about these shows popping up, and I would make a list, either local or not, and try to remember like when to apply for that.
Yeah, I think they're going to start up again soon. I know everything's been on hold the last year and a half, but hopefully, knock on wood, next year, Cake and the Zine Fest are both great shows to start with, like a small press. And even just going, even if you don't have a table, right?
Oh,
I mean,
yeah. That definitely, yeah, I definitely should insert that prior to tabling, I was going with mini comics and just handing them out to all the artists that I enjoyed their work. So.
Yeah, it's a great way to just kind of immerse yourself in a creative community. Like you said, you meet people that are also doing the thing you want to do. So that's really valuable. Danielle Dingerson asks, speaking of agents, would you suggest getting an agent before you introduce yourself to a publisher?
I suppose it depends on what you mean by introduce yourself to a publisher, because if you're going to these comic shows, you're kind of inherently meeting people from publishing houses. But if it's like introduce your story to a publisher, but I don't know, some are pretty closed about getting like public submissions, and the only way to submit to them is to get an agent. I think it feels 50-50. Like there's like stages too of like different sorts of publishers you can get acquainted with at shows. Like you don't necessarily need an agent for like Silver Sprocket, creator owned, and they obtain all their rights still. But getting an agent and getting your pitch in front of some of these big 5 publishers, like that might be the route to go if that's what you have in mind for your story.
Yeah, so you'd have to submit what you're submitting work to the agent before they can submit something to the publishers. And I think that's good advice. For the smaller and independent publishers, you can they're probably dealing with creators on an individual level. So that's doing a little bit of research, finding their submission guidelines, which are probably online. And once we have conventions and events like that, I have found that there's a lot of small press publishers at those events, and you can get your work in front of them. But as you said, for some of the larger publishers, then it's hard to get it in front of them. That's where an agent is very useful.
Very useful. And I'd say that's probably the norm. Like I do know instances, and clearly I was an instance of like knowing an editor there, and that was your way in, but I don't know how common that is. So I guess whichever way comes first. But yeah, I think just getting out and meeting people at the shows and everything is the best first step for sure.
I think what you said, just having the work, somebody walks past the table and you've got finished projects and actual books that you did independently. And that's already a selling point to a publisher, as you said, because they can see like, oh, you sustained this project on your own. So I think it's to answer Danielle's question, it's kind of, you have to make work and you have to put some things together, and maybe smaller books, right? Or smaller portions, or published by chapter, as you showed with Fair Warning, was sort of a serialized almost, right? And then that's a great way to introduce your work to a publisher.
Yeah, I will say like the phrase that I usually would hear from editors or people in the publishing that would come by my table, they'd look at Fair Voyage or they look at Rose and like, what else are you working on? Or like, what other stories do you have? So they see like the finished thing, but then that's already a thing and they would want to hear more. So I think, yeah, both are important.
I think I misspoke. If I accidentally said Fair Warning, I don't know.
Oh.
I was thinking of a Van Halen album or something. Fair Voyage. So I apologize if I misspoke there. And Danielle also has a follow-up question here. When do you know you can go full-time freelance?
Yeah, I've gotten this question before, and I don't want to just say like when it feels right, but like I think when it feels right is when you're feeling completely inundated by your other work, your design, illustration, whatever work, that you can't, it's just physically impossible to keep up with the other job. At least that's how it was for me. And going back to numbers, like when I went full-time illustration, I was doing social media at Busy Beaver, and just looking at the dollar amount that I was making monthly from them, and I was like, can I feasibly make this in illustration? Can I use that time there? And the answer was yes for me, so that's why I decided to make that leap. But I think another part of it too is that there shouldn't be any shame that if you go full-time and then need to go back, like that's not moving backwards in your career. That's, you know, the economy, world changing, that your finances changing, maybe there's an emergency, but there shouldn't be any shame about also getting another job after that.
We are still in the middle of a pandemic, so we've all been adjusting to things. So I think that's a great answer. I see another question came in from Nick Marino. What are your fave things to draw right now? What's keeping you motivated?
Hi, Nick. A friend of mine, unless it's another Nick Marino. But favorite things to draw right now. So for my Patreon, I have a postcard that I send out every month. So I'm constantly trying to generate for that. But what I've been having a lot of fun with is taking my friends' photography and using that as inspiration for the backgrounds or still life, and then kind of adding my own narrative and characters and stuff on top of their work. And so it's a lot of fun, like showing them like, hey, this is the photo that you posted on Instagram 3 months ago. Like I drew it. So that's like fun for me. And then also like trying to challenge myself with more like scenes and full illustrations and like perspective and all that great stuff. And what's keeping Nick says hi. Great. What's keeping you motivated? Honestly, things like this, and then starting to teach at Columbia too, and like being submerged with like emerging artists and younger artists, like that's definitely motivating. I have a very talented gaggle. I hope some of them are watching right now, but a very talented gaggle of students in my class, and just seeing how they, you know, work with the tools that they work with and how they tackle the project. It's very refreshing, and it's inspiring too to see like what they're interested in and what they want to get into, and it just makes me feel like, oh hey, this industry is still alive. It's still kicking a lot. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I on a personal level, it's been very satisfying for me to watch your work over the years. I think I was on a sabbatical and I didn't get to have you as a student in a class, because it would have been that because I was teaching seniors anyway. But it's been nice. Your design sense, everything, the line work and coloring has just gotten so sophisticated, and I think it's a great example of you just kept doing it. And as you said, you just learn more as you go along. So I'd be curious, like what's next for you? So you have a new book coming out in a couple of months or a month and a half, so what's next after that?
Yeah, the book is stuck on the boat outside of LA, I think. But so it's gonna be at the end of the year now. But well, I am going to be starting another book soon as the illustrator paired up with another writer.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that'll be announced soon. But I'll start another graphic novel, and I'm working on a few other comics pitches, also in the capacity of illustrator. But what I really want to do is write and illustrate a book. So I've been working on more writing and honing in on my storytelling skills.
I was going to say, are you learning a lot from working with a writer, collaborating with a writer, so that when you maybe do your own book with your own writing and drawing. How do you think that's impacted you, this experience of collaborating with a writer?
Yeah, I'm a very like, I need to see how someone does something to kind of understand the components of it. So being able to be behind the curtain and like see all the writers I work with their script and like how they figure out their panels and like just seeing how they build an outline, like that's been really valuable to see their process. And I guess like a personal note for me, like seeing how quickly they seem to turn around stuff, I'm like, oh, okay, like maybe it like breaks down some of the facade for me of like, oh, that took them like a good amount of time and they work full time. Like I don't need to like whip this out like in an hour or something like that. But yeah, also just the fact of being exposed to so many different types of writers has been helpful. Like there's not just one way to do it.
Mhm. Well, we're about 7:20 right now, so I don't see any more questions in the chat unless somebody has a last minute one. But I think you've answered a lot of questions and did a great job explaining all of this. So I think we can wrap it up. I just wanted to say thank you again for sharing all this information and being very open and generous about how you share this with not only our students, but now the world at large here on YouTube. And I wanted to also thank Mimi, you, and Jay Myers for their technical assistance. And I should mention we have another lecture in the spring, and that's with Denise Holmes, and it should be February 16th, who is an illustrator that also started teaching here at Columbia. So it's great that it's also been great to see you come back and kind of, what is the word, like pay it forward or something. So like you were a student here and now you can share your experience and your expertise with our current students. So that's wonderful to see. And I just want to say, just wish you continued great luck with all your projects. And thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
All right, someone is saying hold still. Oh yeah, we're going to be closing the YouTube feed. So, but thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. And this will be archived. So look for more information about that. So thank you, Andrea, and thank you everyone who came here tonight to see this.